persuasive speech is going to be on inflation and how it's affected the minimum wage line. Inflation has affected California for years, and despite the minimum wage rates having been changed, people are still struggling to afford living expenses. In 2009, the minimum wage has failed to keep up with inflation, failed to keep up with average wages, and most dramatically, failed to keep up with incomes of the top 1% of CEOs contributing to America's growing inequality crisis. If the people of California want to be able to afford things like housing, cars, electricity, food, and other expensive necessities on their own, the minimum wage must be raised. Otherwise, residents will need at least two other incomes. In my experience, as a resident of California for almost 20 years, I have seen firsthand that living on my own, or even with a second person, will be near impossible without working full-time and working myself to exhaustion. And as a student in college that is a full-time student, this is practically going to be impossible for me, and it is no way to live happily. As someone that lives in a trailer park with my mother and two siblings, I can tell you that even living in one of the cheapest available housing options, there has still been plenty of rough patches for my family. If the minimum wage had kept up with inflation and productivity increases, the minimum wage would be $24 an hour, which is nearly double the $15 per hour minimum wage now. Therefore, we should raise the minimum wage to meet people's needs. Now that I have previewed my speech, let's move on to expenses and how the majority are faring. Why should we raise the minimum wage? People can't afford living expenses such as housing alone in a small apartment, and it's what the majority of most Americans want, and rightfully so. Only 24% of Californian residents can afford median housing. 61% of renters can afford to buy a home in their own city. Now that we have covered this, I'd like to talk about the cause of this problem. Some believe that it's an assault on their freedom as business owners, and that they have the right to choose how much they pay their workers. Classical economic theory predicts that if wages go up, prices will go up anyway. And now that we've discussed what the problem is, let's look for a solution. We could simply raise the minimum wage in California, but I don't think that that's a permanent solution. An automated process of adjusting the minimum wage rather than leaving it up to a year-to-year legislative whim would be a more permanent solution, and therefore I think that it's the best option. With that, I'll wrap this up. We have discussed the hardships of living in California comfortably, my personal experience with inflation, and why we must raise the minimum wage. I believe that an automated process for adjusting our minimum wage as needed should be put into action immediately.